My husband used my own signature to steal the business I built from nothing. He did it while I was recovering from surgery, while I was on pain medication, while I lay in a hospital bed trusting him with papers I was too weak to read carefully. He brought them to my bedside with a smile and said, "Don't worry about these, just routine insurance renewals. I've taken care of everything." I signed. I said thank you. I closed my eyes, and while my eyes were closed, he filed documents that made him the owner of my surgical center. The practice I had built over 9 years with $210,000 of my own savings, a loan secured against my medical license, and 14-hour days that I worked while he slept. He filed documents that listed me, the founder, the surgeon, the only reason the building had ever had a single patient walk through its doors, as an employee. His mother was in on it. His brother was in on it. Their family attorney had prepared the paperwork, and they had been planning it for 14 months. Here is what they did not plan for. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I have held a human heart in my hands while a machine breathed for a patient whose family stood in a waiting room 60 feet below me, not knowing if the person they loved was going to survive the next 30 minutes. I have stood at an operating table for 11 hours without sitting down. I know what it means to stay steady when everything around you is falling apart. And I know something else, something that saved me, something I want every person listening to this to hear and remember. I had documented everything, every contract, every filing, every email, every text message involving my business, backed up to 3 separate systems going back 9 years. I did not do this because I suspected my husband. I did it because I was a surgeon, and surgeons know that the record is the only thing that protects you when someone tries to rewrite history. They spent 14 months planning what they thought was a perfect takeover. I spent 31 days dismantling every piece of it, and then I walked into a conference room with a forensic document examiner, a financial auditor, my attorney, and 2 of my staff members who had refused their bribes and documented every conversation. And I put everything I had on that table. This is that story. Stay with me, because the ending is not what they expected. I noticed something was wrong the moment I pulled into the parking lot of my own surgical center. It was 6:47 in the morning. The lot should have been empty at that hour. My first patient wasn't scheduled until 8, and my staff didn't arrive until 7:15. But there, in the reserved bay closest to the entrance, was Daniel's black Mercedes, and beside it, his mother's pearl white Lexus. And beside that, his brother Clifton's truck, all 3 of them, together before 7 a.m. at my surgical center. I sat in my car for exactly 90 seconds. I know the time because I watched the dashboard clock. I was not panicking. I was processing. There is a difference. Surgeons learn it early or they don't last. Then I got out, walked to the front entrance, the door I had unlocked for the first time 9 years ago with a key I still carry on the same ring, and let myself in. The reception area was dim. The surgical suite lights were off. But the light in my private office, the one at the end of the administrative hallway, was on. I had turned it off myself the night before at 11:52 p.m. after reviewing the expansion contracts I had been negotiating for 3 months. I walked down the hallway. I pushed open my office door. Inside, seated at my desk, in my chair, with my files spread open before him like he owned every page, was Daniel Hargrove, my husband of 4 years. Standing behind him, in the kind of practiced stillness that tells you someone has rehearsed this moment, was his mother, Patricia. And leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, staring at the floor with the studied nonchalance of a man who knows his role in this particular theater is to look inevitable, was Clifton. The 3 of them looked up at me with expressions I will never forget for the rest of my life. Not guilt, not shame, not even surprise, relief. Like I was the one who had finally arrived to a meeting they had been waiting for. Natalie. Daniel folded his hands on top of my contracts. Good. We need to talk. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I have stood at an operating table for 11 consecutive hours without sitting down. I have held a human heart in my gloved hands while a bypass machine breathed for a patient whose family paced the waiting room floor 60 feet below me. I know what it means to stay steady when everything around you is falling apart. I closed the door behind me, set my bag down on the chair by the entrance, and walked to the small guest chair across from my own desk, because he was in mine, and sat down. "By all means," I said, "talk. Let me tell you about Hargrove Surgical Center, because you need to understand what was spread across that desk before you can understand what was happening in that room." I founded this practice 9 years ago. At the time, it was called Chen Surgical Group. My name, my identity, my $210,000 in personal savings from 8 years of residency and fellowship stipends that most people would have quit for. I added a $130,000 small business loan secured against my medical license. I signed the lease on a 3-room outpatient suite in a Denver medical complex, hired 2 staff members, and opened the doors. For the first 3 years, I worked alone. No partners, no investors, no family money. I performed surgeries in the mornings, handled billing in the afternoons, and wrote grant applications at midnight. I ate hospital cafeteria food and drove a 10-year-old Civic and wore the same 4 pairs of scrubs on rotation because every dollar that wasn't rent or loan repayment went back into equipment. I met Daniel Hargrove in year 3. He was a corporate attorney at one of Denver's larger firms. We met at a hospital fundraiser my attending had guilt-tripped me into attending. I was still in scrubs, still running on 4 hours of sleep, standing near the back with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink. He came over without being asked. He brought me coffee. He asked questions about surgery that weren't the usual questions. Not the dramatic ones about blood, not the status questions about salary. He asked about the moment. What does it feel like, he asked, when the patient's heart starts beating on its own again? I told him about my 3rd solo bypass. The patient was 67 years old, a retired school teacher from Pueblo named Mr. Anselmo, who had shown me a photo of his granddaughter moments before they sedated him, and told me she was the reason he needed to survive this. I told Daniel about the moment the heart resumed rhythm, that rolling, insistent muscle memory of life reasserting itself against everything that had tried to stop it. Daniel Hargrove looked at me across a ballroom full of wealthy donors and said, "You talk about saving lives the way most people talk about falling in love?" I should have heard the calculation in that, the assessment, the careful filing away. Instead, I just thought, this man understands me. We were engaged 14 months later, married 6 months after that, and in year 5 of my practice, now 2 years into our marriage, Daniel suggested the rebrand. "Chen Surgical is your name and it's beautiful," he said one evening, sitting beside me while I reviewed billing reports. "But Hargrove has 40 years of business recognition in this city. It could open doors that are currently closed." I thought about it for 3 weeks. I talked to 2 colleagues. I ran the numbers on potential referral growth. Then I agreed, and the doors did open. I won't pretend otherwise. The Hargrove name unlocked rooms I had been knocking on for years. Insurance networks, hospital partnerships, corporate wellness contracts. Within 18 months of the rebrand to Hargrove Surgical Center, revenue had increased by 38%. My practice grew from 3 rooms to 9. Staff went from 2 to 8. Daniel was right, and I was grateful. Gratitude, I have since learned, can be the most expensive thing you ever feel. Because gratitude made me trust him with the books. It made me say yes when he suggested his brother Clifton handle our marketing contracts, even after Clifton's first campaign came in 3 months late and $22,000 over budget. It made me smile and say nothing when Patricia began introducing herself at charity events as co-founder of Hargrove Surgical. It made me rationalize every small alarm as the overreaction of a woman who worked too hard and rested too little and was simply too suspicious for her own good. I was a surgeon. I trusted data. I trusted evidence. I trusted what I could see and measure and verify. What I didn't know was that someone had been quietly rearranging the evidence while I was in the operating room. Back in my office that morning, Daniel slid a document toward me across my own desk. "We've restructured the business," he said. His voice was calm, practiced. He had done this before, in depositions, in boardrooms, in the calculated silences he deployed during our arguments when he wanted me to feel small, for tax purposes and for long-term stability. Patricia spoke then, her voice carrying the particular warmth of a woman who believes her charm is armor. "Natalie, sweetheart, this isn't about taking anything from you, it's about protecting what you've built for the family." I looked at the document, then I looked at it again. According to the paperwork in front of me, Hargrove Surgical Center had been reorganized as a family limited liability corporation. The managing partners, as of 60 days prior, were listed as Daniel Hargrove, Patricia Hargrove, and Clifton Hargrove. My name appeared once as clinical director, an employee of my own company. I turned the page, then the next. I read every line without speaking because I am a surgeon, and surgeons do not react before they have complete information. And surgeons have learned the hard way, more times than I can count, that the first instinct is rarely the right instinct. When I finished reading, I set the document flat on the desk. "How long?" I asked. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "The restructuring was initiated 14 months ago. 14 months ago, I was recovering from an emergency appendectomy. I had been in the hospital for 4 days, then home for 2 weeks, managing pain and a stapled incision and the specific frustration of a surgeon who cannot stand being the patient." Daniel had brought paperwork to my bedside. He had described it as routine insurance renewals that couldn't wait. I had been on hydrocodone. I had signed what he put in front of me. I had said, "Thank you, sweetheart. I don't know what I'd do without you." Patricia reached across and touched my arm. "We know this is a lot to process, but you work so hard, darling. Too hard. You need people around you who can manage the business side so you can focus on what you love. The medicine." She said it with the most beautiful smile, genuine warmth in her eyes, the kind of warmth that costs nothing because it's built on the absolute certainty that she has already won. I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at my husband. I looked at Clifton, still leaning against the wall, still studying the floor. "Thank you," I said. "I'll need a few days to review this with my attorney." Daniel's smile flickered. "Of course. Take your time. But Natalie, the restructuring is already filed. This meeting is a courtesy." A courtesy. He used that word. I want you to remember that. I stood up, I picked up my bag, and I walked out of my own office, down my own hallway, through my own reception area, and out into the Denver morning without raising my voice once. I drove straight to the home of my college roommate, Dr. Priya Mehta, now a healthcare attorney in Denver with 17 years of medical business litigation under her belt. It was 8:15 in the morning. She opened the door in a bathrobe with a cup of tea, took one look at my face and said, "How bad?" I handed her the document Daniel had given me. She read for 11 minutes. I counted. I watched the tea go cold on the table beside her and the morning light move across her kitchen floor. I watched her expression move from confusion to concentration to something that looked like controlled fury. When she finished, she set the folder down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what you'll do if your hands are empty. "Natalie," she looked at me directly, "did you sign any documents during your appendectomy recovery?" Daniel brought paperwork. He said it was insurance. I was on hydrocodone. "Do you have your own copies of what you signed?" "I have copies of everything." This is the thing about being a surgeon that people outside medicine don't fully understand. The paperwork is as critical as the procedure. My mentor, Dr. Elaine Wu, told me this during my first week of residency, and I have never forgotten it. "Document everything," she said. "Not because you expect to be sued, but because the record is the truth, and the truth is the only thing that protects you when someone tries to rewrite history." I had scanned and cloud-backed every document associated with my practice since the day I founded it. Every contract, every filing, every invoice, every email and text message involving any business decision. I had done this not because I suspected anyone. I had done this because I was a surgeon, and surgeons are meticulous by nature, and meticulous people accidentally build their own protection long before they know they need it. Priya spent the next 4 hours at her kitchen table with me. By noon, we had identified 7 documents filed as part of the restructuring that did not bear my authentic signature. 3 of them carried a signature that resembled mine closely enough to pass casual scrutiny, but differed in 3 consistent, repeatable ways that a forensic document examiner would identify immediately. The other 4 carried my genuine signature on pages that had clearly been removed from documents I had signed for entirely different purposes and inserted into the restructuring filings. "He used the insurance renewal pages," Priya said quietly. "Your signature pages were physically removed and placed into the restructuring documents. Can we prove that? The metadata on the original scans you kept will show the document creation dates. The notarization date on the restructuring filing is 9 months after the date you signed those insurance pages." She closed the folder. "Yes, we can absolutely prove it." I sat back and looked at the ceiling of my best friend's kitchen for a long, quiet moment. I thought about the 112 patients currently under active care at Hargrove Surgical. I thought about my 8 full-time staff members who had left better-paying positions at hospital systems specifically because of the culture I had built. A culture where clinical excellence was protected, where every voice had weight, where doing the right thing for the patient was never negotiable, regardless of what it cost the bottom line. I thought about every night I had stayed at the hospital after a complicated surgery because I wanted to be there when my patient woke up. Every conference I had attended on my own time and my own money. Every grant application written at 2 a.m. Every insurance denial I had personally appealed with documented clinical justification, line by line, until I won. And I thought about 14 months ago, a hospital bed, an IV, a stapled incision, my husband standing at my bedside with papers saying, "These are routine, don't worry about these, just sign here, I've taken care of it." "What do we do?" I asked. Priya smiled, not a gentle smile. The smile of a woman who has waited 17 years to deploy every weapon in her arsenal on behalf of someone she loves. "We document everything," she said, "and then we take it all back." What followed was 31 days that I will never describe as anything other than the most clarifying experience of my life. I went home that evening and I was a wife. I made dinner. I asked about Daniel's day. I laughed at the right moments and said nothing that revealed the vault that had locked shut inside me. I had operated on patients in acute crisis without letting them see fear in my face. I could manage a dinner table. What I did during those 31 days, I did between surgeries and after midnight and in my car during the 12 minutes of silence between the hospital parking garage and my surgical center. I did it with Priya, with my accountant Sandra Park, and with a forensic document examiner named Marcus Trent, who had testified in 46 Colorado court cases and charged $400 an hour and was worth every single dollar. We rebuilt the complete paper trail. Every document filed in the restructuring was cross-referenced against my original cloud backups. Marcus identified 11 instances of signature forgery or fraudulent page substitution across 7 separate filings. Sandra reconstructed the full financial timeline and discovered that in the 14 months since the restructuring had been quietly initiated, $187,000 had been rerouted from the surgical center's operating accounts through a subsidiary LLC registered under Clifton Hargrove's name, then billed back to my practice as consulting fees, $187,000 in 14 months. From a business I had built from nothing while sleeping on a secondhand futon and driving a 10-year-old car and putting every dollar above basic survival back into the practice. I also contacted my 2 most senior staff members individually. My lead anesthesiologist, Dr. Kwame Asante, and my practice administrator, Joel Reyes, had each been approached by Daniel separately over the previous 8 months. He had offered them equity positions in the restructured company in exchange for one specific thing: their loyalty to the new ownership structure. Not to me, to them. Both had declined. Both had also independently documented those conversations in writing, dates, times, exact language, and when I reached out carefully and privately, both handed me their notes without a moment of hesitation. Kwame told me he had tried to warn me 6 months ago. He had asked me to lunch and said he wanted to talk about some things he had observed. I had been between 2 back-to-back surgeries, and I said, "Kwame, let's reschedule," and we never had. I sat in my car in the parking garage after that conversation, and I let myself cry. Not for long. 5 minutes. The length of one surgical hand scrub. Then I went back inside and operated on a 58-year-old woman who needed a valve repair, and I was steady and precise and completely present for every second of that 5-hour procedure because she deserved nothing less than everything I had. On day 28, I called Diane Choi, the senior commercial lending officer at First Mountain Bank, who had approved my original business loan and who had watched this practice grow from a 3-room outpatient suite to a 14-suite surgical center. Diane confirmed what I had begun to suspect. In the previous 4 months, Daniel had made 3 attempts to refinance my surgical center's property, a building I had paid off 2 years ahead of schedule, as collateral for a separate business venture. All 3 attempts had stalled because my original ownership documentation predated the restructuring and was legally airtight. He had not been able to take the building. Not yet. I want to tell you about one specific moment on day 30. Priya and I had been at her dining room table for 8 hours straight, working through the final documents. It was around 6 in the evening. The remains of a lunch neither of us had fully eaten were pushed to one side. Priya had just finished walking me through the 4th fraudulent filing, explaining in the precise, measured language of an experienced litigator exactly what had been done, how it could be proven, and what it meant legally. She stopped, put her pen down, looked at me. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not "how is the case?" "How are you doing?" I thought about the honest answer. I am a surgeon. I deal in honest assessments because wishful thinking in an operating room costs lives. I have trained myself over many years to see what is there rather than what I want to be there. I told her, I feel like I've been given a diagnosis I suspected but didn't want confirmed. I'm past the shock. I'm in the part where you build the treatment plan. She nodded. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. "Natalie, the reason we have a case, the reason this works, is because you documented everything instinctively before you had any reason to. That's not luck. That's character. That's who you are. And that is the one thing they could not file around, could not forge, and could not restructure out of existence." She picked her pen back up. That's worth knowing. She was right. The meticulous documentation habit that saved my practice was not something I developed in response to a threat. It was something I had carried since my first day of medical school. The same instinct that made me triple-check medication dosages, the same instinct that made me review imaging personally rather than relying solely on reports. It was not strategy. It was identity. You cannot take that from a person. You can forge their signature. You can reroute their money. You can use their love as a tool of access and their trust as a mechanism of extraction, but you cannot take from them who they fundamentally are, and who they are, if built carefully through honest work and genuine values, will always produce new evidence. Will always be the record that outlasts whatever false story someone else is trying to file with the state. On day 31, I called Daniel and told him I was ready to meet. He wanted to meet at his family's home. Of course he did. Neutral ground means nothing to people who believe all ground belongs to them. I suggested the conference room at Hargrove Surgical Center instead. My conference room, my table, my building, with my name on the original deed. He paused on the phone for only a second. Then he said, "Fine." They arrived together, Daniel, Patricia, and Clifton, flanked by an attorney I recognized from one of Denver's largest corporate firms. His name was Graham Ellsworth, and he was very good and very expensive, the kind of lawyer who specializes in making smaller parties feel the weight of futility before the first document is even opened. Priya was already seated at the table when they walked in. Beside her was Marcus Trent with his bound forensic report. Beside him was Sandra, with 3 years of financial reconstruction documents organized into color-coded binders, and at the far end of the table, quiet and composed, sat Kwame and Joelle. I watched Daniel's eyes move across the room. I watched him register the presence of his 2 failed recruits seated directly across from his family. I watched something shift in his face, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who didn't know him well would catch. Just a small, barely visible recalibration, the slight narrowing of eyes that means the calculation just became significantly more complex. He sat down. He looked at me and smiled. "Natalie, you look tired. Are you taking care of yourself? This is the thing about people like Daniel. They never stop performing, even when they can see the curtain has already come down." I opened my portfolio. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to make sure everyone at this table is working from the same information." I slid the forensic report across the table. "This is Marcus Trent's analysis. Mr. Trent has testified as an expert witness in 46 cases in Colorado state and federal courts. He has identified 11 instances of signature forgery or fraudulent page substitution across the restructuring filings." Graham Ellsworth reached for the report. His expression remained professionally neutral, but his reading speed slowed considerably on the second page. "This," I slid the financial audit across, "is a 3-year reconstruction of the surgical center's accounts, cross-referenced against the subsidiary LLC registered under Clifton Hargrove's name. It documents $187,000 in fraudulent consulting fees redirected out of my practice over 14 months. Clifton's hand, resting flat on the table, curled slowly into a fist. "And these," I placed Kwame and Joelle's documented statements in the center, "are contemporaneous records of the conversations in which my staff members were individually approached and offered equity positions in exchange for their cooperation with the restructuring. Both declined. Both documented the conversations in writing at the time they occurred." Patricia opened her mouth. I continued. "I also have written correspondence from First Mountain Bank documenting 3 separate attempts to refinance this building, which I own outright with a clear title that predates this marriage by 4 years, as collateral for an external business venture." I closed the portfolio. The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Graham. A small, quick glance that asked the question his face would not form out loud. Graham shifted forward. "Dr. Chen Hargrove, the restructuring was filed as a legitimate business reorganization under Colorado statute. I'm sure it was designed to appear that way. That is precisely what the forensic report addresses." Graham tried again. "Your husband has significant—" "My husband's name appears on documents that were filed using forged signatures and fraudulently repurposed pages from documents I signed for entirely different purposes." I kept my voice level. "Conversational almost. That is forgery, Mr. Ellsworth, and fraud. You know that. I know that. And I imagine you are currently having a very important internal conversation about your own professional obligations in this room." Graham went completely still. Patricia's warmth had evaporated. What remained was something older and colder and more honest. "Natalie, you are making a very serious accusation against a man who has supported you. Patricia." I said her name quietly, without heat, and she stopped. "I have supported myself since I was 19 years old. I put myself through undergraduate, medical school, surgical residency, and a cardiothoracic fellowship on scholarships, stipends, and personal debt. I built this surgical center alone, with my own savings and a personal loan. The Hargrove name was added to this practice as a gesture of love, freely given, not as a transfer of ownership. I looked at my husband directly. I have the original founding documents, the original business license, the original bank loan, 8 years of tax returns filed under my sole ownership, the original property deed. Every single one of them predates our marriage, predates the restructuring, and predates the moment you decided that what I had built was something you had the right to take. Daniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than I had expected. I was protecting us, protecting you. You work yourself into the ground, Natalie. You don't eat, you don't sleep. Someone has to think about the future. The future. I let the words sit in the air between us for a moment. You rerouted $187,000 into your brother's LLC to protect my future. He had nothing to say to that. Here is what is going to happen. I opened the portfolio to the final section and extracted 3 copies of a prepared document. This is a full restoration of the original corporate structure, naming me as sole owner and managing director. It reverses the restructuring entirely. It dissolves the family LLC, and it requires full repayment of $187,000 within 90 days. I slid 1 copy to Graham, 1 to Daniel, 1 to Clifton. Alternatively, I file the forensic report and the financial audit with the Colorado Attorney General's office this afternoon, and we allow the state to determine the appropriate next steps. Graham picked up the restoration document. He read for 90 seconds in complete silence. Then he set it down, removed his reading glasses, and looked at Daniel. And that was the moment, that precise, unmistakable moment. Because Graham Ellsworth, who was very good and very expensive, had just done the same calculation I had done 31 days ago. He had looked at the evidence, he had assessed the exposure, and he had arrived at the only conclusion available to an attorney who intends to keep his license. Graham leaned toward Daniel and spoke quietly. A single sentence. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at me across the table, not with anger, which I had expected, but with something that looked almost like grief, as though he had only just now understood what he had actually lost. Not the business, not the restructuring, me. The woman who had told him about a retired school teacher's granddaughter at a hospital fundraiser and made him feel something real for the first time in years. If that version of him ever existed, he had buried it under 14 months of calculation. We could negotiate a different structure, he said. His voice was lower now. The performance had finally dropped. What was underneath was smaller and more honest, something that gives you full control but keeps the family involved in an advisory capacity, something that, no. The word came out of me with a quiet finality that surprised even me, not hard, not angry, just completely, immovably certain. There is no structure that includes people who forged my signature while I was recovering from surgery. There is no advisory role for a family that tried to make me an employee of my own life's work. There is nothing to negotiate. Silence. Patricia pressed her fingertips to the table. Clifton had not moved in several minutes. He was staring at a fixed point on the surface in front of him, the specific stillness of a man who has finally understood the weight of what he participated in. I looked at Clifton directly. I want you to understand why this mattered. He had said perhaps 8 words during this entire meeting. He had positioned himself throughout as the background character. The brother who was just along, just following, just a name on a document. But his name was on the LLC. His name was on the account that received $187,000 from my practice. His silence now was not innocence. It was calculation of a different kind. The calculation of someone hoping that staying small might save him. Clifton. He looked up. The LLC repayment is not optional, and it is not negotiable. Every dollar, within 90 days. If it requires you to liquidate assets, that is a consequence of a decision you made freely. His Adam's apple moved. He nodded once. Graham slid a pen across the table toward Daniel. Daniel picked it up. He held it for a moment, long enough that the room felt the weight of it, long enough that Patricia drew a breath as if she might say something, long enough that I thought he might actually still try to walk away. Then he signed. 3 copies. His name, then Clifton's, then Graham's as witness. The scratch of the pen against paper was the only sound in the room. When it was done, I collected the documents with the same methodical care I use to close a patient's chart at the end of a procedure. Align the edges, place them in order, return them to the portfolio, close the clasp. I stood. "Thank you for coming," I said. And I meant it with exactly as much warmth as it deserved. I want to be honest with you about what came after, because this is not the kind of story where winning the table means winning everything. The restructuring was reversed. The $187,000 repayment was formalized in writing. Graham Ellsworth withdrew from the case 2 days later, citing a conflict of interest, which is attorney language for I am not going down with this ship. I filed for divorce 8 days after the signing, and then I went back to work. That is the part of the story without a dramatic scene. There is no moment where the operating room erupts in applause, no triumphant speech, no music. There was just a Monday morning and a full surgical schedule and a 44-year-old father of 3 who needed a coronary artery bypass, and my hands, and everything I had spent 14 years training them to do. But there are things I want to tell you, things that happened in the margins of those weeks that I think about when I try to understand exactly what was lost and exactly what was kept. Kwame brought coffee to my office the morning after the signing. He set the mug on my desk without comment. Then he said, without preamble, "I should have made you take that lunch 6 months ago. I am sorry." I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He had documented everything. He had shown up at the table. He had done exactly what integrity requires. He said, "You built something worth protecting. I hope you know that." Later that day, during a pre-operative briefing, I found myself watching my team move through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who have worked together long enough that the choreography has become instinctive. Kwame at the anesthesia station, Joelle reviewing the schedule board, my surgical nurses arranging instruments in precise, familiar order. And I thought, this is what they could not touch. They rerouted $187,000 from my accounts. They spent 14 months constructing a legal fiction designed to reclassify me as an employee of my own life's work. They used my love and my trust and my gratitude as the instruments of their plan. But they could not touch this, the culture of this place, the reason Kwame turned down equity and stayed, the reason Joelle wrote down every conversation instead of staying silent, the reason my staff arrives early and stays late not because I asked them to, but because they have decided, each of them individually and freely, that this place is worth their best effort. That is not built with a name change or a restructuring filing. That is built in thousands of ordinary moments over years. In the decision to stay late when you could leave, to tell the truth when it would be easier to stay quiet, to show up for someone when showing up costs you something. You cannot forge that. You cannot file it with the state. You cannot reorganize it into someone else's column on a balance sheet. There is a version of this story I almost told myself. The version where my staff didn't notice, where the atmosphere of Hargrove Surgical remained sealed and professional and untouched by what was happening inside my marriage. That version is false. I know this because in the weeks following the signing, my people talked to me. Not all at once, not formally. The way people talk when they have been holding something for a long time and have finally been given permission to put it down. Rosa, my lead surgical nurse, 15 years in operating rooms, unshakable under any clinical pressure, stopped me in the supply corridor one afternoon. She said, "Dr. Chen Hargrove, I want you to know something." She paused in that way she pauses before delivering a difficult number mid-procedure. "Last year, your husband came in on a Saturday when you were at the conference in Chicago. He said he was doing a facilities review. He photographed every room. He took copies of our equipment leases from the administrative files. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She said, "Because he was your husband." And I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like something it might not be. She looked at me for a moment. I should have said it anyway. I'm sorry I didn't. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, and I meant it. Because this kind of operation is designed precisely to make the people around you uncertain about what they're seeing. The ambiguity is not accidental. The ambiguity is the entire mechanism. It weaponizes the loyalty of the people who care about you, turns their hesitation to hurt you into a shield for the person who is. Marcus, my billing coordinator, a meticulous, quiet man who had been with the practice since year 2, told me that Clifton had called him twice during the previous year, ostensibly to discuss the consulting arrangement. Actually, Marcus said, to ask very specific questions about revenue per procedure, payer mix breakdown, and projected growth for the next 3 fiscal years. I thought he was just nosy, Marcus said. I figured family members of owners sometimes think they have a right to know things. He paused. I gave him general numbers, nothing detailed. He set a folder on my desk, but I pulled everything I told him anyway, in case you need it. The folder was meticulous, organized by date, with notes on the exact questions asked and the responses given. Marcus had documented every conversation without being asked, without fanfare, simply because he was the kind of person who understood that records are protection. That is what a real team looks like. Not the people who perform loyalty when everything is going well, the people who, quietly and without announcement, build the record that saves you when things go wrong. 3 weeks after the signing, I received a handwritten letter from Patricia Hargrove. Cream stationery, navy ink, her initials embossed at the top, delivered to my surgical center by courier. Even now, even here, the performance of refinement. The letter said she was heartbroken, that she had always loved me as a daughter, that Daniel had acted without her full knowledge, a claim the documented evidence did not support, that she had only ever wanted to protect me, to ensure the business was in good hands so I could focus on the medicine I loved. It said my decision to file for divorce was devastating to the entire family, that she hoped I would not allow the actions of imperfect people to destroy the bonds she had worked to build. It ended, "You are brilliant, Natalie. You always have been. But brilliance can be lonely. Don't let your pride cost you more than it already has." I sat with that letter for a while, not because it moved me, but because I wanted to understand it fully. Because I am a surgeon, and surgeons examine everything carefully before deciding what to do with it. Here is what that letter was. It was the final move of someone who had run out of legal options. It dressed exploitation as love and calculation as concern. It reframed evidence of fraud as a family misunderstanding. And most deliberately, it reframed my decision to protect my own property as pride, as an emotional failure, a character flaw, something I should be ashamed of and talk myself out of. The last line is the one I want to hold up for a moment. You are brilliant, but don't let your pride cost you. The simultaneous compliment and diminishment, the acknowledgement of capability paired with the suggestion that the capability becomes dangerous when it isn't tempered by the right kind of deference to the right people. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire career, from attendings who praised my surgical instincts and then questioned my ambition in the same breath, from colleagues who called me impressive and then described me as difficult, from a professor in medical school who told me I had the strongest clinical reasoning in my cohort and then recommended I consider a less demanding specialty because certain fields, he said, can be hard on women who don't know how to be flexible. Flexible. That was his word. I have never forgotten it. I wrote Patricia back, 1 paragraph, on Hargrove Surgical Center letterhead. I wrote, "I appreciate your letter. I want to be clear that my decision to restore my business and dissolve my marriage was not made in anger or haste. It was made on the basis of documented evidence reviewed over 31 days with legal and forensic counsel. I wish your family well, Please direct any further correspondence to my attorney. I signed it. Dr. Natalie Chen Hargrove. I have not heard from her since. In the weeks after the divorce was filed, the memories returned like lab results I hadn't ordered but could not ignore. The first Christmas after Daniel and I married. His mother hosted. I arrived from a 36-hour call shift, still in my hospital badge. Patricia had looked at me with her warm signature smile and said, "Natalie, you work so hard, you must be exhausted." Then she turned to Daniel and said, "Sweetheart, tell Natalie about the Hargrove Family Endowment we'd like to establish at your surgical center." Your surgical center? His? I had smiled and said it sounded wonderful. I had been too tired to notice the pronoun was wrong. A business conference in Chicago 3 years into our marriage. I had been invited to present outcomes data from our minimally invasive valve repair program, work I had spent 2 years documenting, refining, and verifying. Daniel had come with me. At the dinner following my presentation, a colleague approached us and said, "Your husband tells me you're doing extraordinary work at Hargrove Surgical. Your husband tells me," as though my work had been narrated into existence by someone else. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink for 3 minutes, water running, trying to understand why I felt hollowed out after what should have been a triumph. The night I stayed at the hospital after a complicated triple bypass, sleeping in the on-call room rather than driving home on 2 hours of rest. I texted Daniel at midnight. He replied 6 hours later, "Don't you think you're overdoing it? The center basically runs itself now." I read that message and put my phone away and went back to the patient's chart, because the center did not run itself. The center ran because I never stopped running it. And some part of me had always known that Daniel did not see that, and some other part of me had always chosen not to name it. The summer Clifton was given the marketing contract. I had objected once quietly, pointing out that Clifton had no background in healthcare marketing and that our previous agency had generated measurable referral growth. Daniel said, "Family helps family, Natalie. It matters to him." I agreed, because I loved my husband, because I wanted his family to love me, because I had learned somewhere along the way to make myself smaller in the spaces where my own voice might cause discomfort. The irony, if that's even the right word, is that the very habits they tried to exploit were the same habits that saved me. My documentation, my cloud backups, my insistence on keeping copies of everything, 3 systems deep. Not because I suspected anyone, because I was a surgeon who had once watched a patient nearly die because a critical record couldn't be located, and I had promised myself that morning that no critical record of mine would ever go missing. They planned their extraction for 14 months. I had been accidentally building my defense for 9 years. People ask me now whether I think Daniel ever actually loved me. I think about this question more than I would like to admit. Not because the answer changes anything, because I am a scientist, and scientists are constitutionally incapable of leaving questions unanswered. Here is what I believe. I believe Daniel was genuinely attracted to me, not manufactured, not purely strategic. I believe that when he asked me across that fundraiser ballroom what it felt like when the heart started beating again, he was honestly curious. But I also believe that somewhere in his interior architecture, love and leverage occupy the same room, that he did not experience a meaningful difference between cherishing someone and acquiring them, that the woman he fell in love with, the surgeon who talked about saving lives the way most people talk about falling in love, was always, in some part of his mind, an asset, a remarkable one he felt genuine warmth toward. But an asset. And assets in Daniel's world are something you manage, protect, control, optimize, reorganize for maximum long-term value. What he never understood, what Patricia never understood, what Clifton never understood, was that I was not an asset that could be managed without my knowledge. I was the engine, and you cannot quietly restructure the engine while it is running and expect everything to keep working. I say this without bitterness, or at least with the kind of bitterness that has been processed into something more useful. into the boundary-setting workshops I now run twice a year for women physicians, the mentorship program I established for women in surgical training, the scholarship fund I created for medical students from first-generation and low-income backgrounds. The $187,000 repaid by the Hargrove family went directly and entirely into that scholarship fund, every cent, because I refuse to allow what they took from me to be something that only costs me. I insist that it pay forward. The divorce was finalized 11 months after that morning in my office. I kept the surgical center. I kept the building. I kept the name, not because of Daniel, but because I had built it into something real and it was mine. And I refused to allow his family's actions to strip me of the years of work I had done to make that name mean something in this city. I did change the branding. The logo now carries my original initials alongside the full name, NCH Hargrove Surgical Center. N for Natalie, C for Chen, H for Hargrove, and for the work I did to reclaim that name from the people who tried to hollow it out. Daniel moved back to his family's home. He left his firm 6 months after the divorce. I don't know the details, and I did not seek them. Clifton dissolved the consulting LLC. Patricia, I understand, has become very devoted to her garden. I tell you this not to be unkind, but because this is what accountability looks like when the evidence is irrefutable and the documentation is complete. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet, logical conclusion of truth-meeting record. The surgical center now employs 19 people. We have added a second operating suite and a cardiology satellite clinic. In March, we received accreditation as a center of excellence in minimally invasive cardiac surgery, one of only 4 programs in the state of Colorado to hold that designation. I got the letter on a Tuesday. I was between cases. I read it standing in the hallway with my mask still around my neck, and I made a sound that Joelle later described as not quite crying, but in the immediate neighborhood. She brought champagne to the Friday staff meeting, plastic cups, grocery store cake, 19 people around a conference table that had once seated 2. Kwame gave a toast. He said, "And I want to give you this exactly as he said it, to Natalie, who built something worth protecting, and who protected it." I drove home that night through the November dark, the Denver skyline spreading across the distance, and I thought about something Dr. Elaine Wu said to me on the last day of my fellowship. She had watched me close my locker for the final time, and she said, "The most dangerous thing that will ever happen to your career, Natalie, won't happen in the operating room. It will happen in the rooms you don't think of as operating rooms." I hadn't understood her then. I had written it off as the abstracted wisdom that senior physicians dispense when they want to sound profound. I understand it now. Every room where your life is being constructed, your home, your marriage, your business, your name, is an operating room. You must be as present in those rooms as you are in the ones with the sterile drapes and the monitors and the careful, irreversible work of the blade. Because the things built in those rooms hold your heart just as surely, and they can stop just as suddenly. And when they do, you need to already have the documentation. I am Dr. Natalie Chen Hargrove. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I founded a surgical center from nothing, protected it when someone tried to take it, and built it back larger than it was before they tried. I am also a woman who loved someone who taught her, at considerable cost, the difference between a partner and a predator. And I am grateful for that lesson. Not in the way we say we're grateful when we mean we wish it hadn't happened. In the real way. The way that has changed how I move through every room, not just the surgical ones. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I started a mentorship program for women in surgical training. 8 participants in the first cohort, all at that precise and precarious stage of their careers where the demands of the profession and the demands of the world collide with maximum force. The point where the data shows women leaving medicine at disproportionate rates. The point where the math of sacrifice and recognition stops adding up. I run the sessions with Kwame and Joelle in the same conference room where Daniel and his family sat across from me with their attorney and their filed documents and their certainty that I would fold. I chose that room on purpose. I want every woman who sits in it to know even without knowing the story, that this is a room where someone was supposed to lose and didn't. I teach them to own what they build, not metaphorically, legally, structurally, in documented, verifiable, defensible reality. I teach them the difference between a mentor and a creditor, between a supporter and a silent shareholder, between someone who loves you and someone who is positioning themselves near you in anticipation of your success. I teach them that gratitude is real and necessary, and is also the specific vulnerability that certain people will exploit if you do not understand where it ends and where your ownership begins. One of my mentees, a third-year surgical resident named Aisha, who reminds me of myself at 28 in ways that are both flattering and sobering, asked me something at our last session that I have not stopped thinking about. She said, "How do you know when someone is actually in your corner versus when they're just standing close to you because of where you're going?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Watch what they do when you fail, not when you succeed. Success draws everyone. The people who bring champagne when you win are plentiful, and they are not the evidence. Watch what they do when a surgery goes wrong and you are sitting alone in a consultation room at midnight writing an incident report. Watch what they do when an insurance company denies a critical claim and you have to make the call to the patient yourself. Watch what they do when you are exhausted and frightened and the right path forward is not clear and you need someone present who has no agenda. The people who show up in those moments, without calculation, without currency, without a ledger of what your eventual gratitude might be worth, those are your people." Aisha wrote that down. Then she looked up and asked, "What if you're still figuring out which people around you are which?" I thought about it. Then I said, "Pay attention to who asks about the work versus who asks about the numbers. The people who genuinely love what you're building will ask about the work, what it felt like when it went well, what you learned when it didn't. They will be curious about the thing itself, the patience, the decisions, the culture you're creating, the daily texture of what you've made. The people who are positioning themselves will ask about the numbers first. Revenue, growth projections, market value, not because they're indifferent to the work, but the first question reveals the orientation. It tells you what they believe the thing is fundamentally for. I thought about Daniel at that fundraiser, asking what it felt like when the heart started beating again. And I thought about Daniel 2 years later, suggesting the rebrand while mentioning the Hargrove name's market weight in the same sentence. I thought about the distance between those two conversations and how long it took me to see that the orientation had shifted, or perhaps had never been what I thought it was. I was not naive. I want to be clear about that. I was a woman who loved someone and who, as a consequence of that love, interpreted his interest in my success as care rather than acquisition. That is not naivety. That is what love does. It is also a vulnerability. And understanding it as a vulnerability, not with shame, but with the same clear clinical honesty I bring to any assessment, is what ensures I will not make that particular mistake again. I know who my people are. I know because they showed up in a conference room with documentation I never asked for. They declined equity arrangements and told me about them. They showed up for work the morning after the confrontation and did their jobs with the same precision and care they had always had because they were not there for the equity. They were there because they had decided, each of them independently, freely, that this was a place worth being. No legal instrument creates that. No filing produces it. No restructuring manufactures it. It is built in thousands of ordinary moments between people who choose again and again to be honest and present and worthy of the trust placed in them. I know what I have. I know what was almost taken. I know the difference between the two. And some things, once built with care and sacrifice and the specific devotion of someone who gives everything to their work, belong entirely and permanently to the person who built them. No signature can transfer that. No restructuring can touch it. It is yours. Protect it accordingly. If this story made you feel something, If some part of it reminded you of yourself, of someone you love, of a moment when you stayed quiet when you should have spoken, or trusted when you should have verified, or made yourself smaller to keep the peace, then this story was for you. You are not alone in that. I was not alone in that. And knowing that is the beginning of changing it. If you found value in this story, I have one simple request. Hit the like button right now. Not for me, for the next person who needs to hear this. Every like tells this platform that this story matters, that these conversations are worth having, and that the people watching deserve more of them. It takes 1 second and it changes everything about who finds this video next. Share this with someone. You know exactly who I mean. The friend who is working twice as hard as anyone around her and getting half the credit. The woman who keeps saying everything is fine when you can see in her eyes that it is not. The person who has been trusting the wrong people for too long and has not yet realized that the record they have been quietly keeping is actually their protection. Send it to them right now before you close this window. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply say, I heard something today. I thought of you. You should hear this too. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. Click the bell so you never miss a story. Because this is what we do here. We tell the true stories. The ones about people who were underestimated, overlooked, pushed aside, taken advantage of, and who did not collapse, who documented, who prepared, who walked into the room anyway, who said no with a quiet finality that needed no explanation. Those stories matter. You matter. And I will see you in the next one.